An 1864 family photo hides a secret. Zoom in on the enslaved man's wrist. Dr. Eliza Wilson adjusted her glasses as she examined the dusty photograph found in the historical archives of Charleston University. The yellowed 1864 image showed the Patterson family, Patriarch James, his wife Eleanor, and their 3 children all dressed in elegant clothing. In the background, almost like a shadow, a black man stood with downcast eyes and hands folded in front. Just another typical Civil War era photograph, Eliza murmured to herself as she scanned the image. As a specialist in 19th century African American history, she had cataloged hundreds of similar photographs, each telling its own silent story of America's complex past. The photograph had been donated anonymously to the university's collection last month, part of a batch of Civil War-era memorabilia. Something about this particular image had drawn Eliza back repeatedly over the past few days, though she couldn't quite articulate what caught her attention. In her cramped office in the history department, surrounded by books and artifacts, Eliza used specialized software to enlarge and enhance the image. She first focused on the family arrangement, typical for the era, with the father standing prominently, wife seated, children arranged by height. While examining the distant face of the enslaved man, something unexpected caught her attention. Adjusting the contrast and sharpness, she moved to the man's hands. Wait a minute. On the man's right wrist, partially visible where his sleeve had risen slightly, was a distinctive birthmark, a crescent moon-shaped patch with a peculiar hook at one end. Eliza frowned, something stirring in her memory. She returned to the full image, now zooming in on James Patterson's face. On his right temple, partially hidden by graying locks, was an identical mark, the same crescent with the same distinctive hook. Eliza felt a chill run down her spine. Coincidence? Extremely unlikely. The peculiarity of the mark was too unique, too specific. Professor Gardner needs to see this, she said aloud to the empty room, quickly printing both enlargements. That night, Eliza couldn't sleep. The matching birthmarks suggested a genetic link between the white patriarch and the enslaved man, possibly father and son. If confirmed, this photograph could provide tangible evidence of a history that many American families had deeply buried. The unacknowledged children of plantation owners with enslaved women. Children who sometimes lived alongside their half-siblings, separated only by the cruel line of skin color and social status. The Charleston County Library held detailed records of the Patterson estate. Eliza spent the entire morning examining yellowed documents, searching for any mention of the man in the photograph. The musty smell of old paper filled her nostrils as she carefully turned fragile pages, meticulously documenting every reference to the Patterson plantation and its inhabitants. Here, she finally whispered, her finger landing on an 1842 property record. Isaac, age 22, acquired by James Patterson in March 1842. The description included birthmark on right wrist, shaped like a crescent moon, and noted that Isaac was purchased for the unusually high sum of $1,200, significantly above the market rate for the time. Beside Eliza, local archivist Clara Johnson watched with interest. In her 60s, Clara had spent decades preserving Charleston's complicated history, including its painful chapters. Found something significant? She asked, noting Eliza's intense focus. Possibly, Eliza replied, showing her the enlarged photograph. This man, Isaac, has the same distinctive birthmark as James Patterson. I'm suspecting an unacknowledged paternal relationship. Clara nodded slowly, unsurprised. Wouldn't be the first time. I have something that might help your research. Wait here. She disappeared into the archive's restricted section, returning 15 minutes later with a fragile leather-bound diary protected in an acid-free box. This belonged to Rebecca Green, a midwife who served both white and black families in the 1840s. Her records were remarkably detailed for the time. In the yellowed pages, Eliza found an entry from May 1842. Today, Hannah delivered a strong boy at the Patterson plantation. The infant bears the family mark, a moon on the wrist just like his father. Mr. Patterson paid extra for my silence and discretion in this matter. The mother is recovering well. Eliza's heart raced. This was the connection she needed, documentary evidence supporting her theory. Hannah must have been Isaac's mother, Clara suggested, piecing together the timeline. And according to this, James Patterson knew about his son, Eliza added, tracing the faded handwriting with her finger. Yet he kept him enslaved, his own flesh and blood. The diary contained several more entries about Hannah, describing her as intelligent, beautiful, and favored in the house. Several passages mentioned James Patterson's special interest in Hannah's son, ensuring he learned to read despite laws forbidding literacy among enslaved people. The typical contradiction of the time, Eliza sighed, closing the diary carefully. Acknowledging his blood privately while publicly maintaining the racial hierarchy. I wonder how many other families have similar secrets buried in their histories. Clara's eyes held decades of wisdom. More than most people are comfortable admitting, Dr. Wilson. Much more. The University Cafe buzzed with afternoon activity as Eliza sat across from Michael Davis, a history professor at Howard University who specialized in genealogical research and African-American family histories. A light rain tapped against the windows, creating a soothing backdrop to their intense conversation. So, you believe this enslaved man was the plantation owner's biological son? Michael asked, carefully studying the enlarged photos through his wire-rimmed glasses. The same birthmark is compelling evidence. The evidence is growing stronger, Eliza replied, spreading out copies of her findings. Same distinctive birthmark, the midwife's diary, property records showing an unusual purchase price. But I need more, ideally, a connection to the present day. Michael nodded thoughtfully, stirring his coffee. Historical patterns often repeat across generations. These hidden family connections sometimes survive in unexpected ways. He paused, considering something. I might know someone who can help. A former student of mine, Tanya Phillips, has been researching her family history for years. She believes she's descended from people who were enslaved on the Patterson plantation. Last time we spoke, she mentioned finding some old family letters referencing a Patterson connection. That could be exactly what I need, Eliza said, leaning forward eagerly. Would she be willing to meet? 3 days later, Tanya arrived at Eliza's office, a slender woman with intense eyes and a determined set to her jaw. She wore her hair in neat braids and carried an old leather portfolio that had clearly seen decades of use. Professor Davis explained your discovery, she said, settling into a chair opposite Eliza's cluttered desk. My great-great-grandmother Rose was born on the Patterson plantation in South Carolina around 1858. According to our family stories, her father was Isaac, who worked as a house servant on the plantation. Eliza's pulse quickened at the name. Do you have any family photographs or documents from that era? Not from the 1860s, unfortunately, Tanya said, but I do have this. She pulled out her phone, displaying a scanned photograph of an elderly woman from the 1920s. This is my great-grandmother Josephine, Rose's daughter. She lived to be 98 and was born just after the Civil War ended. Eliza zoomed in on the image, examining the elderly woman's features carefully. Then she gasped. There, on the elderly woman's temple, was a faint but unmistakable crescent-shaped birthmark. The family mark, Eliza whispered, her voice barely audible. Tanya's eyes widened in recognition as she looked between the historical photograph and her family image. What does this mean exactly? It means, Eliza said slowly, careful to control her academic excitement in the face of what was, for Tanya, deeply personal history, that you're likely a direct descendant of both the enslaved man Isaac and James Patterson himself. Your family carries both bloodlines. Tanya stared at the old photograph again, her hands trembling slightly as she traced the outline of Isaac's figure. My grandmother always said we had the mark of our true history in our family. I never understood what she meant, until now. The Patterson family mansion had been converted into a historical museum decades ago. The grand antebellum structure, with its imposing white columns and sweeping veranda, now stood as both a testament to the South's architectural heritage and a complicated monument to its troubled past. Eliza and Tanya walked its polished halls together, studying portraits of stern-faced ancestors that lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow visitors with aristocratic judgment. The Pattersons were one of Charleston's elite families, the tour guide explained, her practiced speech flowing smoothly as she led a small group through the main parlor. James Patterson made his fortune in cotton and rice, owning 3 plantations by 1850. He had 3 children with his wife Eleanor, William, Robert, and Mary. William's line continued the Patterson name, and his descendants still live in Charleston today, prominent in medical and legal circles. Tanya's eyes lingered on James Patterson's portrait, carefully examining the hairline where the birthmark would be partially hidden. In the painting, his hair conveniently covered that area of his temple, though whether by coincidence or design was impossible to determine. The family silver bears the Patterson crest, the guide continued, gesturing to a display case. Notice the crescent moon motif, a symbol the family has used for generations. Eliza and Tanya exchanged meaningful glances at this revelation. The family mark had been incorporated into their official symbolism, hiding its genetic significance in plain sight. Would it be possible to contact William's descendants? Eliza asked the guide after the tour concluded. For research purposes. Dr. Thomas Patterson is on our board of trustees, she replied, clearly impressed by the family connection. He's quite proud of his heritage and occasionally gives lectures here on the family history. I could pass along your contact information. That afternoon, Eliza called Dr. Patterson's office at the Charleston Medical University, where he worked as a distinguished cardiologist. I'm researching a historical photograph featuring your ancestor, she explained carefully to his assistant, deliberately omitting her specific findings. The image raises some interesting historical questions I'd like to discuss with Dr. Patterson. 2 days later, they sat in Thomas Patterson's elegant wood-paneled office at the medical school. At 70, he had the same piercing blue eyes as his ancestor, though his face was kinder, less severe. My family has been in Charleston for 7 generations, he said proudly, showing them a leather-bound family album with gilt-edged pages. We've preserved our history meticulously. What specific aspect of our family history interests you, Dr. Wilson? When Eliza carefully mentioned Isaac and the photograph, Thomas's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. There have always been rumors about plantation owners and slaves, but without concrete proof, they're just stories, aren't they? His tone was measured but defensive. Eliza hesitated, then showed him the enlarged photographs highlighting the distinctive birthmark. Thomas fell silent, his hand unconsciously moving to his right temple, where beneath his silver hair, the same crescent mark was faintly visible. My granddaughter was born with this mark, he finally said, voice barely audible. We've always called it the Patterson moon. I never realized... He trailed off, staring at the image of Isaac. Who is this man to you? He asked Tanya directly. Rain drummed against the windows of Eliza's apartment as Tanya and Thomas sat in uncomfortable silence, the weight of history heavy between them. Outside, lightning occasionally illuminated the Charleston skyline, followed by rumbles of thunder that seemed to emphasize the tension in the room. The enlarged photographs lay between them on the coffee table, irrefutable evidence of a connection both had suspected, but neither had fully confronted until now. So, Tanya finally said, cradling a mug of untouched tea between her palms, we're family. Thomas stared at his hands, his academic and social confidence momentarily stripped away. His fingers traced the rim of his coffee cup, a nervous gesture revealing his inner turmoil. This is difficult to process. Not unwelcome, but unexpected. Imagine how Isaac felt, Tanya replied, a hint of challenge in her voice. Knowing his father owned him, seeing his half-siblings live privileged lives while he remained property. Thomas winced visibly at her words. The sins of our fathers, he murmured, shaking his head slightly. I can't defend it. Not just sins, Eliza interjected gently, sensing the need to shift the conversation toward historical understanding rather than recrimination. There's more to this story that complicates the narrative. She opened the midwife's diary, carefully turning to several marked passages. There are multiple entries suggesting James secretly taught Isaac to read, despite strict laws against literacy for enslaved people. And later records show Isaac was actually freed in 1855, 9 years before this photograph was taken. Then why is he standing with the family like a servant? Thomas asked, clearly confused by this revelation. Eliza pointed to the diary's final entries from 1864. Rebecca writes that Isaac stayed on as a paid servant after emancipation. She specifically notes that he remained close to James's youngest son, Robert, his half-brother by blood, if not by law. The photograph appears to have been taken during a family gathering, where Isaac was present not as property, but as an employee who was also kin. Thomas looked up sharply, recognition dawning in his eyes. Robert was my great-grandfather. He never married Eleanor's daughter, Mary, as family lore claims. Instead, he married a woman from Virginia named Catherine. And according to my family's oral history, Tanya added, setting down her tea, Isaac named his daughter Rose after a young girl in the Patterson household. The family stories say they played together as children despite the social boundaries. Thomas reached for his leather portfolio and pulled out a faded sepia-toned photograph protected in an acid-free sleeve. This is Robert with his daughter, Rose Patterson. The photograph dates to approximately 1870. Tanya gasped softly and retrieved her phone. With trembling fingers, she pulled up a saved image. And this is my great-great-grandmother, Rose, Isaac's daughter. The photograph was taken around the same time. Side by side, the two young women from different worlds shared the same eyes, the same high cheekbones, and the same determined set of the jaw. The family resemblance was subtle but unmistakable to anyone looking for it. They knew, Thomas whispered, his academic detachment finally crumbling entirely. They knew they were cousins, and from the way they are dressed so similarly in these photographs, they acknowledged it in their own way. The question is, Eliza said quietly, what do we do with this knowledge now? Eliza's research led them to the University of Virginia's Special Collections, where Robert Patterson's personal papers were archived after being discovered in the attic of a family summer home that was sold in the early 2000s. The university's archive building was modern and climate-controlled, a stark contrast to the aged documents it protected. These papers haven't been fully cataloged or digitized, the archivist explained, bringing out acid-free boxes sealed in protective plastic. She wore white cotton gloves as she carefully set the containers on the table in the quiet research room. They were donated by the Patterson estate about 20 years ago, but we've had limited resources to process the collection completely. You're actually among the first researchers to request access. Eliza, Tanya, and Thomas spent hours conducting a methodical examination, carefully documenting each item they reviewed. Most of the papers were mundane, business correspondence, personal notes, and family letters discussing everyday matters of the post-Civil War South. Thomas found the experience particularly moving, reading his ancestors' handwriting for the first time and gaining insight into the personality behind the stern portrait. Near the bottom of the third box, Tanya found a yellowed envelope that stood out from the others. Unlike most letters addressed to specific people, this one was marked simply for Isaac in a careful, educated hand. Look at this, she said quietly, showing it to the others. With permission from the archivist and wearing protective gloves, she carefully extracted the fragile paper inside. The letter was dated July 15th, 1870, nearly 5 years after the Civil War's end. My dear brother, though we share this bond in secret, I have always considered you family in the truest sense. Father confessed everything to me before his death last winter, and I have carried both the burden and the blessing of this knowledge since then. Your daughter Rose and my Rose have formed a friendship that brings me both joy and sorrow, joy that our blood recognizes its own, and sorrow that the world would condemn this natural affection between cousins if the truth were known. I have deposited funds in your name at the Freeman's Bank in Charleston. It cannot repay what was taken from you, but perhaps it might secure a better future for Rose and her children after her. The account book is enclosed with this letter. When they take our photograph next week for Father's memorial, stand proud. One day, perhaps, the truth of our family will be known without shame or secrecy. Your brother in blood, if not in law, Robert. Tanya's hands trembled as she read the words aloud, her voice gaining strength with each sentence. Thomas's eyes glistened with unshed tears as he heard his ancestors' words, acknowledging the truth his family had hidden for generations. The photograph in question, Eliza realized, making the connection, must be the one I found in the university archives. It wasn't just a typical family portrait. It was taken for James Patterson's memorial. Robert knew, Thomas said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. He acknowledged Isaac as his brother. He didn't challenge the system openly, but he found ways to recognize the truth privately. Tanya stared at the letter. And he made sure there would be evidence for future generations to find. He wanted the truth to come out eventually. Eliza's office walls were covered with timeline charts, photocopies of documents, and family trees. Over the weeks since their discovery, her neat academic workspace had transformed into an investigative war room. Color-coded sticky notes connected events across generations, and digitally enhanced photographs tracked family resemblances through time. Thomas and Tanya sat together at a small conference table, adding notes to the expanding web of connections they'd uncovered. What we're seeing here is remarkable, Eliza explained, using a laser pointer to highlight key documents. After the Civil War, Isaac established a successful carpentry business in Charleston. City records show that he specialized in fine cabinetry and furniture repair. She pointed to a yellowed newspaper advertisement from 1868. And records from Robert's accounts show that he was Isaac's first client, commissioning an entire dining room set. Financial support disguised as business patronage. Thomas nodded, making the connection. Clever and socially acceptable way to help his brother while maintaining appearances. Exactly, Eliza confirmed. It gave Isaac economic independence while preserving the social facade both men needed to navigate post-war Charleston society. Tanya pointed to another document they'd uncovered. According to these church records from First Presbyterian, both families attended the same church after 1870, though sitting in different sections, as was customary. The baptismal records show both Roses were christened there, only 3 months apart. I found something even more significant, Eliza added, pulling out a folder of newspaper clippings she'd gathered. The Charleston Mercury mentioned both men serving on a committee to establish Charleston's first integrated school in 1872. They were publicly connected through civic engagement, even if their true relationship remained private. The door opened as Professor Gardner entered with a sealed envelope. His normally serious expression was animated with excitement. The chemical analysis came back on the photograph, he announced. The results are fascinating. It's definitely original, not retouched or manipulated in any way, but there's something else that's interesting. The position of Isaac in the photo breaks conventional composition rules of the era. What do you mean exactly? Thomas asked, leaning forward with interest. Professional photographs from this period followed strict compositional protocols, particularly for family portraits that included servants or enslaved people, Gardner explained, spreading out comparative examples on the table. Enslaved people or servants were typically placed at a much greater distance from the family, or positioned to emphasize subservience, often standing behind chairs at a lower level or at the extreme edges of the frame. But Isaac stands at almost the same level as James, creating a subtle visual link between them. And look here, he pointed to Isaac's hand, which rested just inches from Robert's shoulder. This proximity would have been considered highly inappropriate unless specifically requested. The photographer must have been deliberately breaking convention, Eliza realized, examining the composition with fresh eyes. This arrangement was intentional, a coded message for future viewers who knew what to look for. So the photograph itself was a subtle act of rebellion, Tanya said softly, touching the image reverently. A permanent record of a truth they couldn't speak aloud. A time capsule, Thomas agreed, nodding slowly. Waiting for someone like you to decode it, Dr. Wilson. Ouched. And there's something interesting. The position of Isaac in the photo breaks conventional composition rules of the time. What do you mean? Thomas asked. Enslaved people or servants were typically placed at a greater distance from the family or positioned to emphasize subservience, Gardner explained. But Isaac stands at almost the same level as James, creating a subtle visual link. The photographer must have been in on it, Eliza realized. And this composition was deliberate, a coded message for future generations. So the photograph itself was an act of rebellion, Tanya said softly. A permanent record of a truth they couldn't speak aloud. A time capsule, Thomas agreed. Waiting for someone like you to decode it, Dr. Wilson. Charleston's spring heat pressed against them as Eliza drove Tanya and Thomas to the old Magnolia Cemetery, where both Pattersons and the descendants of their formerly enslaved people were buried, separated by a low stone wall that seemed to embody the racial divisions of American history. The sprawling graveyard was lush, with azaleas and dogwoods in full bloom, nature's beauty a stark contrast to the painful divisions the cemetery's layout preserved. Isaac is buried here, Tanya said, navigating confidently through the colored section of the cemetery, as it had been designated in the 19th century. She led them to a modest granite marker partially hidden by overgrown grass. Unlike the elaborate Patterson monuments on the other side of the wall, with their angels and biblical inscriptions, Isaac's grave was simple, though the stone itself was of good quality. And according to family stories passed down through generations, he specifically requested to be buried within sight of his kin. No one in my family fully understood what that meant until now. Thomas stood silently before the grave, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. The inscription read simply, Isaac Freeman, 1820, 1895, a free man in life and death. Freeman, Thomas murmured. He took that name after emancipation, a declaration of identity, Eliza observed, and perhaps a quiet acknowledgement of his true lineage. Thomas walked slowly to the dividing wall, touching the weathered stones. From this vantage point, the Grand Patterson Mausoleum was clearly visible just 50 yards away. Separated even in death by this wall, not completely separated, Tanya pointed out, gesturing toward a small gate in the wall. Its iron hinges rusted with age. The wall has a gate. It was locked for decades, according to the groundskeeper, but it exists, a passage between worlds. That evening, they gathered in Thomas's study at his historic Charleston home, surrounded by Patterson family albums spanning generations. The leather-bound volumes contained careful records of births, marriages, and notable family events, all meticulously preserved. I found something remarkable, Eliza said, spreading out photographs from both families across several decades. She had painstakingly matched dates and events from both family archives. Look at these images. They show the same gatherings from different perspectives. Here's the Charleston Exposition of 1902, the Memorial Day Parade of 1911, the Church Picnic of 1924. All the same events appear in both family albums, with the White Pattersons in one set of photos and Isaac's descendants in another. They were documenting the same community events from different perspectives, Thomas realized, seeing the parallel timelines. More than that, Tanya added excitedly, aligning two photographs of a 1910 Independence Day parade. Look closely here. My great-grandmother Josephine and your grandmother Elizabeth are standing almost side by side in the crowd, both wearing the same unusual brooch with a crescent moon design. This couldn't be coincidence. Thomas's eyes widened in recognition. Elizabeth's personal journal mentions her secret sister several times. I always assumed it was a reference to a childhood imaginary friend or a schoolmate. They knew, Eliza confirmed, piecing together the evidence. Generation after generation, they kept the connection alive through these small, deniable gestures. Identical brooches, attending the same events, maintaining proximity while respecting the social boundaries of their time. The university auditorium was packed for Eliza's presentation. Local media crowded the back wall, drawn by rumors of a significant historical discovery. History isn't just written in textbooks, Eliza began, but hidden in plain sight, in photographs, letters, and family stories waiting to be connected. The enlarged photograph of the Patterson family appeared on screen, followed by a series of close-ups showing the matching birthmarks. This isn't just a story about one family, she continued. It represents thousands of unacknowledged connections across America's divided racial landscape. Thomas and Tanya sat in the front row, now comfortable in each other's presence. When Eliza invited them to the stage, a murmur rippled through the audience. My name is Dr. Thomas Patterson, Thomas said into the microphone. And today I learned that my family history is both more complicated and more rich than I ever knew. Tanya stepped forward. I'm Tanya Phillips, and the man in this photograph, Isaac, is my great-great-great-grandfather. But so is the man beside him, James Patterson. Cameras flashed as they stood shoulder to shoulder, the family resemblance subtle but unmistakable. After the presentation, reporters crowded around them. What does this mean for the Patterson family legacy? One asked. Thomas looked thoughtfully at Tanya. It means our family is bigger than we thought, and perhaps it's time to take down some walls. Do you feel this changes your identity? Another reporter asked Tanya. No, she replied firmly, but it expands our understanding of American history. These connections weren't exceptions. They were common, just hidden. 6 months later, on a perfect autumn day with golden light filtering through ancient oak trees draped with Spanish moss, Charleston's historic Magnolia Gardens hosted an unprecedented gathering. Under the spreading branches, where generations of Charlestonians had strolled, the descendants of James Patterson and Isaac Freeman met for the first official family reunion, bringing together branches of a family tree that had been artificially divided by history, law, and social convention. Thomas and Tanya had worked tirelessly over the intervening months, contacting scattered relatives, explaining their discovery, and organizing this historic meeting. They had faced skepticism, reluctance, and occasional outright resistance, but also curiosity, openness, and even relief from those who had suspected family connections but lacked concrete evidence. Some family members had embraced the revelation immediately. Others needed time to adjust to this new understanding of their heritage. But today, nearly 100 people had gathered, drawn by the power of blood and history. The attendees spanned the full spectrum of human coloration, from fair-skinned, blue-eyed descendants of the White Patterson line to the darker complexions of Isaac's direct descendants. Yet many bore subtle familial resemblances that became apparent as they mingled. The same determined jawline, the same distinctive laugh, the same mannerisms that seemed to have persisted across generations and racial boundaries. Eliza watched from a respectful distance, moved by the tangible results of her historical detective work. Her research had now been published in the American Historical Review, and similar investigations were underway across the country as other families sought to uncover their own hidden connections. Universities and historical societies had begun systematic reviews of their photograph collections, looking for similar visual evidence of kinship. "You've started something remarkable," Professor Gardner said, joining her with a glass of lemonade. He nodded toward a group of younger family members laughing together over shared family stories. "They did," Eliza replied, gesturing toward the gathering. "Starting with Robert and Isaac, who ensured this photograph would preserve their truth for future generations. I just helped decode the message they left behind." Oh, at the center of the gathering, displayed on an ornate easel, stood a professionally restored version of the 1864 photograph. Beside it was a new one, taken today in the same location, with Thomas and Tanya at the center, surrounded by their extended family, finally united. The compositional parallel between the two images was striking and deliberate, a visual testament to history acknowledged and perhaps beginning to heal. A small girl about 5 years old approached the historical photograph, studying it with intense curiosity. She pointed at Isaac's image. "He has the moon mark like mine," she exclaimed delightedly, rolling up her sleeve to show a crescent-shaped birthmark on her wrist to her mother. "Yes, sweetheart," her mother replied, bending down beside her. "That's our family's mark. It connects us across time." The little girl nodded solemnly, absorbing this information with the straightforward acceptance of childhood. Then she ran back to play with her newfound cousins, untroubled by the complexities of the history that had both divided and connected their family for generations. Eliza smiled, watching the child disappear into the crowd. In that young girl, history's weight was being transformed into something new, not forgotten or erased, but reconciled and incorporated into a more honest and complete understanding of American identity. The secret hidden in an old photograph had finally served its purpose, bringing together what should never have been separated. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the garden, the gathered family members assembled for one final photograph. This time, there was no need for coded messages or hidden meanings. They stood together openly, a living testament to the complex, painful, but ultimately unbreakable connections that formed the true fabric of American history.